Okay, last week we spoke about Chanuka a little bit, and again, today is Chanuka still, so I'd like to continue discussing Chanuka, and perhaps a little historical perspective. The Gemara tells a story which really took place some 200 years before the Chanuka story, approximately, maybe less than that, that there was a minor holiday that was observed on the 25th of Teves. Chanuka is the 25th of Kislev. The next month, the 25th of Teves, there was a minor holiday. Doesn't find a place in our calendar today. And it was called Yom Har Gerizim, the day of Har Gerizim, Mount Gerizim. Har Gerizim was the place where the Kusim, the Shomronim, lived. This was a Gentile people who had undergone a forced conversion, and their status was doubtful. Some considered them Jews, some did not consider them Jews, but in any case, they were very, very much in opposition to the Jewish establishment. So the Talmud tells the story that they approached Alexander the Great, and they asked him to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. That he should take over Yerushalayim and destroy the Beis HaMikdash, and he agreed. So they accompanied his troops on a march to Yerushalayim through the entire night, and this was conducted by torchlight, the Gemara says. So the people in Yerushalayim got word of the imminent invasion. So the high priest at the time, whose name was Shimon HaTzadik, he also took a group of people, and by torchlight they traveled toward the oncoming army. So the Gemara says that at the crack of dawn, Alexander asked the Kusim, who are these people that are approaching? And he said, those are the rebellious Jews. They're the ones you're out to attack. And as they got closer, and Alexander the Great could see Shimon HaTzadik, so it says that he got off his chariot and he bowed down to Shimon HaTzadik, to the high priest. So they said to him, Melech Godel Kamoischa, a great king such as you, Yishtachavel Yehudi Zeh, you should bow down to that Jew, that dirty Jew. So Alexander the Great said to them, I'll read you the words, Dumus Yukno Shel Zeh Menatzachas Lefanai Bebeis Melchamti. When I go to war and I am victorious, I see his image before me. So Alexander the Great said that whenever I go to war, I see the image of Shimon HaTzadik in front of me. And that's why I'm bowing to him. He is the key to my military success. So, needless to say, the decree was averted, and the Beis HaMikdash was spared, and the anniversary of that event was the 25th of Teves. It became a minor holiday. There were many such holidays. They all lapsed when the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. But the question we have to ask ourselves is that why was it that it was the image of Shimon HaTzadik that Alexander the Great always saw when he was victorious in war? Like, why should that be? Like, all the things he could have seen, it was the Yuknai, the image of Shimon HaTzadik. There's another Gemara. There's a Gemara Maseches Megillah that brings a verse in the Teichacha, in the curses that the Torah prescribes if the Jews lapse in their observance of the Torah. So God says you'll suffer this calamity and this calamity and this calamity. It'll be very, very, very difficult. But God promises, nevertheless, that even when you are under the control of foreign nations, le'ma'astim, that I have not scorned you, le'ka'altim, I haven't rejected you, l'chaleisam, I would never do anything that could lead to your destruction, l'hafer brisi itam, nor to violate my covenant. So there are four expressions. God says that as sinful as you are and as harsh as the punishments will be, there will not be an utter rejection of the Jewish people. So the Gemara says, what do these four expressions refer to? So the Gemara says as follows, that one of them refers to the Babylonian period. That in the Babylonian period, I appointed Doniel and Hananiah, Mishael and Azariah, the great Jews of the Babylonian period. So that's the sign of my not rejecting the Jewish people. And the other expression refers to the period of Persia's ascendancy. So then, also there was no rejection. I gave them Mordechai and Esther, who were the leaders of the Jews during the time of the Persians. And then, in the time of the Greeks, I gave them Shimon HaTzadik and Chashmonai Ubanov, Mattisya Kohen Gadol, Mattisyahu the high priest, and they were the Jewish leaders at the time of the threat from the Greeks. And finally, in the times of the Roman ascendancy, so I appointed Rabbi, Yehuda Hanasi, the Chachmei Hadoros, and the sages of the generations. And basically what the Gemara is saying is that these four expressions, that God does not reject us, means that even in the very difficult times, God provides us with leadership. He gives us the leadership we need. So in the Babylonian period, it was Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. In the Persian period, it was Mordechai the Esther. In the Greek period, it was Shimon HaTzadik and Mattisyahu the high priest. In the Roman times, it was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and the sages of subsequent generations. Now it's very interesting. Shimon HaTzadik did not live in the time that we were threatened by the Greeks. Shimon HaTzadik, again, was about 200 years before that. Shimon HaTzadik was in the time of Alexander the Great. Antiochus of the Chanuka story was 8 generations later. There was a dynasty, the Seleucids, who were the kings of Hellenist Syria. After the breakup of Alexander the Great's empire, he was the 5th king named Antiochus, and there were other kings interspersed. He was the 8th generation after Alexander the Great. So it was really some time. Shimon HaTzadik was not contemporary with the Chanuka story. Mattisyahu, the high priest, of course, was. But in what sense is he considered the leader that stood up for the Jews, that helped the Jews, that was provided for the Jews during this period? It's important to understand that in the Chanuka story, the decrees of Antiochus, the very harsh decrees that Jews should give up Shabbos, and they should give up circumcision, and they should give up the Jewish calendar, and so on and so forth, study of Torah. This was only the final manifestation of the opposition of Hellenism and Judaism. Already at the time of Alexander the Great, there were threats. Not the threat of forced conversion, not the threat of forced rejection of Jewish practice, but the very subtle influence, the alienating influence of Hellenism was already a problem for Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, wherever he conquered, he built cities for the purpose of spreading Hellenist culture. Alexandria of Egypt is probably the finest example of it. It was a city of culture, of libraries and theaters and academies, and it was really the fountain which spread Hellenist culture throughout Egypt. And so it was, wherever he conquered, he built such cities and he stocked them with books and with scholars in order to spread Hellenist culture. The irony is that Antiochus, the Antiochus of the Chanuka story, was not particularly interested in culture. He really was interested in the life of pleasure and collecting taxes to support that. So he was sort of an anomaly Hellenist world. But the threat of the Yavan to Judaism was already a threat from the time of Alexander the Great. And therefore God provided leadership to strengthen us, to enable us to stand up to that threat. And therefore the leadership was not only Matisyahu Kohen Gadol. Matisyahu Kohen Gadol was the high priest who stood up to Antiochus many generations later. But Shimon HaTzadik was the leader of the Jewish people. We'll try to explain in what sense. That enabled us to fight off the threat of the Hellenists. Chazal tell us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu always creates the refuah before the makkah. He always creates the cure before the disease. Now, if you look at Megillas Esther, the Purim story, Esther was already well placed in the palace before Haman rose to power. So Chazal say that that's the meaning. After these things, after Esther became queen, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu arranged that Haman should be promoted to be prime minister. So Chazal say that that's exactly what it means. After the cure was in place, now the disease can be administered. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu always makes the refuah before the makkah. If the refuah would not be in place, if the cure would not be in place, the makkah would not be sent. And therefore, that's what Chazal are telling us. That if there would not have been a Shimon HaTzadik, then Alexander the Great would not have been successful. So the threat of Hellenism to Judaism was only because the cure was already in place, because there was a Shimon HaTzadik who was there to fight it, who was there to lead us in the fight against it. And therefore, says Alexander the Great, that when I waged war, and I was successful in conquest and in spreading Hellenist culture, I always saw the image of Shimon HaTzadik before me. In other words, he attributed his success to Shimon HaTzadik, and it was true. Because had there not been a Shimon HaTzadik, then Alexander the Great would have been stopped dead in his tracks years before. But because the Jewish people had what it took to resist the Hellenism that Alexander the Great was spreading, that's why he was able to be successful in his conquests. So therefore he had tremendous respect. I mean, he didn't know I had respect, but he saw this image. Whenever he went into battle, he saw this image. But that's the significance of it. Because there was a Shimon HaTzadik, therefore Alexander could be successful. Let's try to understand exactly what this Gemara means. What is this idea of these leaders, the leaders of the Babylonian period, the Persian period, the Greek period, and ultimately the Roman period?
Are these two Gemaras both in the same place?
No, one is in Megillah, one's in Yuma. Totally apart. The Maharal says an amazing explanation of this Gemara, which will give us a understanding of the history of the times. But before we go into it, let me repeat something that we've discussed in the past. We tend to think of Jewish history as being cyclical. There was the period of the first temple, which was 410 years, and then the temple was destroyed. Then the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, and then the restoration of the second temple, which was 420 years, and then the Romans destroyed the second temple, and there was the beginning of the current exile. Chazal tell us that the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed for three terrible sins: the sins of idolatry, incest, and murder. And the second temple was destroyed for the sin of sinas chinam, the gratuitous hatred of Jews for one another. Now we tend to think that the scheme is as follows: that we were guilty of these sins, and therefore the first temple was destroyed. And during the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, these sins were paid for, and our accounts were clear when we returned to build the second temple. And during those 420 years, we racked up a different sin, the sin of sinas chinam, which led to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and the current exile. The Malbim in his commentary to the book of Daniel, says that that is an inaccurate way of looking at things. And he brings a fascinating verse in Daniel, which says that the sins of the first temple period required 490 years for their punishment. The verse says, Shvuim Shivim, 70 weeks of years. Now, a week of years is 7 years. So if there are 70 weeks of years, that's 490 years. Nechtach al amcha, been decreed upon your nation, lo hosem chatas u'lechalei pesha, in order to wipe away the sins. So the period of punishment for the sins of the first temple period was 490 years long. Not the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, 490 years. So what are the 490 years? Well, we think about it for a second. It's a very simple calculation. It must mean the 70 years of the Babylonian exile plus the 420 years of the second temple period. Meaning that our assumption that after the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, all was forgiven, and the Jews had a clean slate and were making a fresh start, is a mistake. But the second temple period was also a period where the Jews were being punished for the sins of the first temple period. It took 490 years for those sins to be wiped away. And unfortunately, during that time of punishment, the Jews had begun to commit a subsequent sin, the sin of sinas chinam, which led to the destruction of the second temple. But the 420 years were not a restoration as much as an alternative form of punishment, whereas the initial punishment was 70 years of exile outside of Eretz Yisrael. Now there are 420 years of punishment in Eretz Yisrael. Now the Malbim offers a fantastic conjecture to explain why that was. Because, in fact, the Torah tells us, in addition to the three sins of Avodah Zarah, Gilui Raya, Shvichas Damim, those were the sins for which the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. But exile, the exile from Eretz Yisrael was for a different sin. It was for the sin of neglect of Shemitah, the mitzvah of leaving the land fallow in the sabbatical year. Now, the Chazal tell us that the 70 years of exile in Bavel were because the Jews neglected 70 Shemitahs. There were 70 sabbatical years the Jews neglected. Now, so the Malbim offers a very reasonable conjecture. He says that if Jews fail to observe 70 Shemitahs, it's unlikely that in the 6 years in between Shemitahs they were absolutely pious. Just every seventh year they fell into the trap of sin. Doesn't make sense. Probably they were guilty of committing sins over 490 years. 490 years involves 70 years of Shemitah. So they had to be punished for 490 years because they were sinful for 490 years. Those 490 years included 70 Shemitahs. So of the 490 years of punishment, 70 of them entailed exile. The remaining 420 could be back in Eretz Yisrael. So the entire period of the Golus Bavel and the period of the 420 years of the second Beis Hamikdash was a time of punishment for the sins of the three cardinal sins which they committed in the run-up to the destruction of the first temple. The truth is that this is the meaning of a verse in Chumash. It says that God tells us that when you are in exile in Babylonia, I will bring you back to Eretz Oivehem, to the land of your enemies. Which is very, very strange. The Jews were already in exile in Babylonia. What does it mean God will bring them back to the land of their enemies? The Ramban says that Eretz Yisrael, in the second temple period, is called Eretz Oivehem, the land of our enemies. Because during the second temple period, it was under the control of foreign nations. Like Persia, Greece, ultimately Rome. So it's considered Eretz Oivehem, it's the enemy's land. Even when we came back to Eretz Yisrael after the Golus Bavel, it was Eretz Oivehem. This is what Ramban says. Now, that's the background. Now I can tell you what the Maharal says. Morale says that the three nations, Babylonia, Persia, and Greece, or the Hellenists, correspond to the three sins for which the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. It says, we know from the historical record that Babylonia did not try to kill their Jewish captives, and really what they did was they destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. They brought us to Babylonia, and there they pressured us to practice idolatry. They wanted us to embrace their idolatrous practices. And what that means is that the Babylonians were the agent of punishment for the sin of idolatry. Since Jews voluntarily committed idolatry, so we were punished by them. Our Beis HaMikdash was destroyed by them, and they made decrees that in captivity we were meant to practice idolatry. Who were the leaders that stood up to that? This is Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. You read the book of Daniel, you'll see these are the ones that resisted the attempts. It really was two different episodes. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den for his continuing to pray to God. Right? Daniel's competitors got Nebuchadnezzar to make a decree that anyone that worships any other god, aside from the Babylonian gods, will be punishable by death. And of course they knew that Daniel was a regular practitioner of Jewish prayer, prayed to the Ribbon Shlomo, and as a consequence he had to be thrown into the lion's den. But he was almost martyred for the practice of religion. Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, we know, right? They were thrown into the fiery furnace because they refused to bow down to the statue, the idol that Nebuchadnezzar had built. So these were the role models. These were the leaders. And this is a fantastic thing, you know. You think about it, it's such an amazing irony. You know, when Jews practice idolatry voluntarily, what is the punishment? The punishment is you'll be coerced to practice idolatry. Yeah, and this is a pattern that repeats itself again and again and again and again. And I've told the story many times about the person who was traveling to Russia, and he brought 2 pair of tefillin to Russia, and he delivered them, and when he came back, the rabbi wanted to thank him and said, you know, you inconvenienced yourself to bring tefillin into the Soviet Union when it was difficult. He says, perhaps you would consider, you know, putting on tefillin. So he said, Rabbi, he says, when they make a law in America that you're not allowed to wear tefillin, that's when I'm going to start wearing tefillin. And it sounds funny, but we're like that. Because as long as we have the freedom, then we choose, yes, to practice, not to practice. You know, I can always go back to it. I can always change my mind. I always can, you know, embrace Judaism again. So therefore, it's not so important. What difference does it make whether I keep Shabbos, don't keep Shabbos, keep kosher, don't keep kosher? It says, when I want to, when I'm motivated, I will come back to it. So the Breitowitz says, listen, says, if you give it up, don't think it will remain your choice forever. That you can always go back to it. Says there'll be someone with a sword or with a spear or with a gun who will force you to live by the choices you've already made. And this is something you have to know, because many people, when they make these choices, when they think they can opt out for a while, they think, listen, it's not a permanent break. I'm not keeping up Judaism. So I can come back to it when I'm good and ready. So right now I'll have a good time. I'll sow my wild oats, I'll get it out of my system, then I'll come back. So because the Rabbi tells us it's not that way. He says if you give it up, if you forsake your practice, don't think you can just come back any day you want. Just walk right in, and it'll be as if you never left. So there'll be a Babylonian there who will threaten you with the lion's den or threaten you with the fiery furnace, right, to guarantee that you will live by the choices you made. You practiced idolatry in Eretz Israel, you'll practice idolatry in Babylonia. And there were only these very, very hardy people, Daniel, Hanani, Mishael, Azariah, were able to resist, but they were the leaders. They were the inspiration for their generations. So that was the leadership that God provided. That's exactly what we needed. Because we needed that leadership that would stand up to those threats, not to practice idolatry in the Babylonian captivity. But that's what Maral says, that Babylonia, they were the agent of God's retribution for the sin of idolatry. Let's talk about Persia. Well, the great decree of Persia was the threat of annihilation. Because Haman, he activated the entire mechanism of the Persian government to bring about a decree of annihilation against the Jewish people. Well, the parallel makes sense. If the Jews were guilty of murder, then a very appropriate sanction would be physical annihilation. So he says something which is an amazing thing, because this is not recorded anywhere in the Gemara. He says that the decree of Haman was the retribution for the murder that took place in Eretz Israel in the First Temple period.
Is it a specific murder, or
it happened? It happened. I mean, this you have to understand. When the Gemara says that there was shvichas dam, there was murder, I mean, does it mean like rampant murder, random killings, drive-by shootings? I mean, what was it exactly?
So why the 10 sons?
Pardon?
The 10 sons of Haman.
That was, Haman was defeated, ultimately. We're talking about before that. We're talking about that Haman, had the Jews not repented, right, Haman would have been successful in annihilating the Jews. For what sin? Says the Maral, tremendous chidush, something which is not apparent from the Gemara in Masechet Megillah, that it would have been for the sin of the murders that took place in the First Temple period.
So the murders of his son had nothing to do with it.
Well, then afterwards, when Haman was defeated, Jews repented, so then Haman and his children were executed, right, for what they wanted to do to the Jewish people. But that's what it was all about.
When was Zechariah murdered? Was it the First Temple?
That was one of the murders of the First Temple period.
Right.
Amazing thing. And says the Maral that what was Greece? What was the threat of Greece? The threat of Greece was for the sin of Gilui Arayas. It was the sin of Gilui Arayas, incest, promiscuity, and for that we had the threat of Greece. Oh, by the way, let me just go back one step. And of course, and who were the leaders at the time of the Purim story? That was Mordechai and Esther. That was the leadership that was provided. That, of course, led us through the process of repentance and Shuvah, which led to the annulment of Haman's decree. Now, Greece, what we're talking about now, says the Moral, corresponds to the sin of Gilui Arayas, the sin of incest, sexuality. Now here it's hard to understand at first glance what does Greece have to do with this, until we're reminded of a theme which runs through many of the Maral's writings. The Maral says a fantastic thing. As Chazal say, it's actually a statement of Shimon HaTzadik himself, that the world stands on 3 pillars: on Torah, and Avoda, and Gemilas Chasadim. The 3 pillars, the 3 reasons for which the world was created were the study of Torah, Avoda, serving God through prayer and sacrifice, and Gemilas Chasadim, the performance of kindnesses among people. And Maral says there's a parallel between these 3 pillars and the 3 cardinal sins: murder, incest, and idolatry. Now again, idolatry and avoda, of course, that makes perfect sense. Legitimate avoda is why the world was created. Avoda zara, foreign service, paganism, that's the antithesis. The antithesis of Gemilas Chasadim, of kindnesses, is obviously murder. There's no greater violation of the imperative to treat your fellow man well than killing him. He says, but here again we have this strange parallel. So what does Torah correspond to? Torah corresponds to Gilui Arayos, to incest. The cardinal sin of incest, forbidden sexuality, somehow corresponds to Torah. Here the parallel seems to break down. And the Maharal explains it in the following way. He says that when we talk about our mitzvahs, our obligations, our commitments, they fall into three categories. First is the way we relate to God. Second is the way we relate to our fellow man. And the third is how we relate to ourselves. Ben Adam La'atzma calls it. A man relates to himself. To God we're meant to relate in a certain way, a submissive way. It should involve avoda, worship, etc. Obviously, avodah zarah is the antithesis of that. There's no greater breach of our obligation to serve God than to serve a false God. So that makes sense. That's been Adam l'makom. Between man and God, we have to have a certain relationship. Certain things are off limits. Ben Adam l'chaveiro, again, we're meant to act in a kind way, a generous way, a benevolent way. That's kamilas chasadim. If you kill someone, obviously that's a breach of that. The question is relating to yourself. What is a person meant to be? What type of person is a person meant to be? Now we know that we possess a dual nature. On the one hand, we are physical beings. We have a lot in common with animals, right? We eat, we drink, we sleep, we mate, we reproduce. And these are animal functions. And a person can be drawn to that side of his being. The person can live as a person who is driven by his animal desires. Needless to say, we will fulfill those desires in a more sophisticated way than the average animal. Because we will not walk on all fours and eat grass. Because we will look in a cookbook and put together something a little more elaborate to satisfy our hunger. But that culture, in a sense, is taking the human intelligence and turning it into a servant of the animal side. The animal is happy to eat whatever comes its way, and the human being says that I'm going to eat on a higher plane, so I'll develop a cuisine and techniques for cookery and so on and so forth, so that I can satisfy my animal hunger in a more advanced way.
Epicurean.
Well, that could be one way of looking at it. But there's another side of us. There's an intellectual side of us. There's a spiritual side of us. There's a higher side, which devotes itself to meaning, to purpose, to connection to the divine, to intellectual pursuits. That's a different aspect. And we all face the choice of what will the nature of our lives be? Will we be drawn after the physical, material, animal side? Or will we be drawn after the uniquely human side, the intellectual side, the spiritual side? And a human being is a dualism. A human being is really a composite of these two opposites. And there's a tug of war. Which way will we go? It really is a battle of Torah against Arayos. Because illicit sexuality is the ultimate surrender to the animal side, and Torah study is the ultimate victory of the spiritual side. And that's the choice that we have. That is the choice we have. In other words, Torah and Arayos are the two polar opposites, the two extremes. This is the choice we have in terms of defining ourselves, the type of people we want to be. We know that the Greeks were opposed to the study of Torah, to the wisdom of Torah. So we tend to think, well, it wasn't that they were a non-spiritual people. They were very intellectually sophisticated and quite advanced. It's just they had an alternative system. We have a system of Jewish wisdom, they had a system of Greek wisdom, and the two don't see eye to eye on some essential things. But we certainly would not consider them guilty of debauchery or anything like that. They're also on a very high spiritual plane. But Chazal saw it differently. Chazal said that when a Jew gives up his spiritual legacy, it is not because he wishes to embrace a different spiritual alternative. In other words, the Jew is greatly at risk of going down the drain, so to speak, in a most illicit way. And therefore the Greek king that was really the lightning rod for the Chanuka story was not a intellectual. It was not a philosopher king. Right? It wasn't like Alexander the Great, who, as we mentioned last week, I believe was the disciple of Aristotle. It was Antiochus Epiphanes, the insane Antiochus, for whom life was an orgy and of wine and women and amusements, and essentially it was a regime that was designed to collect taxes to finance this wild lifestyle. That was the ultimate threat of Yavan against Yisrael, because that's the alternative. You see, if we give up our Judaism, it's not we're going to become Plato and Aristotle. If we give up our Judaism, we're at risk of becoming Antiochus. So who is the leader that gives us the ability to stand up to that threat? That's Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik historically was the beginning of a very, very critical period in Jewish intellectual history. Fantastic thing. It says in Pirkei Avos that Moshe received the Torah from Sinai, gave it to Yeshua. This came to the Nevi'im, to the prophets, and the Nevi'im gave it to the members of the Knesset HaGedolah, the members of the Great Assembly. Shimon HaTzadik was one of the members of the Knesset HaGedolah. Shimon HaTzadik is just at the juncture where prophecy ends and the Jews only have access to spiritual insight through Torah study. As long as there were active prophets, if a person needed direction in making a life decision, in dealing with a personal problem, you could go to a prophet and you'd get communication from heaven. It says, with the ending of Nevuah and the beginnings of the Knesset HaGedolah, we're dealing with a new situation. Now, insight is going to be derived from Torah study. Now, that's a difficult thing. Right? When God tells you what to do, it's easy. He says, when you have to figure it out on your own, find the answers in Torah, it's a lot harder to do. But that's what Shimon HaTzadik was. Shimon HaTzadik was the beginning of that period of time. And that was the leadership we needed at the time. Because what the Yevanim were threatening, they were threatening Torah. They were threatening that avenue to deriving spiritual enlightenment. Shimon HaTzadik was in place. That's what the Gemara says, that the Lo Ga'altim, that did not scorn them, didn't ultimately reject them, was really that in the time of the threat of the Hellenist period, we had Shimon HaTzadik. We had Torah leadership that was able to show us where the answers were in Torah, even in the absence of prophecy. And therefore, it might have been 200 years before the actual Gezeirus of Antiochus, but that's okay, because we're not talking about a cure which comes when the disease kicks in. We're talking about the cure that is in place well before it was in place 200 years before, so be it. It's also not a long time on the divine scale. 200 years is a blink of an eye. But it was in place. And that's what Shimon HaTzadik is all about. And that really is the challenge to Yovan. And this is something we have to understand. You know, when a Jew gives up his Jewish heritage, I'm not talking about people who are totally ignorant of it. Sadly, we live in a time where there are many people, many people, the vast majority of our Jewish brothers and sisters are totally clueless. You know, they are the unfortunate victims of decisions made for them by their parents, grandparents, some instances great-grandparents. You know, a Jew who knows very little of his heritage today is blameless. You can't criticize him for not knowing. And sadly, the ignorance is breathtaking. And what people don't know is just astounding. You know, I'm almost frightened to even think about it. How little the average person knows about his own heritage. I think most of us know more about, most Jews, I know more about Christianity and Islam than about Judaism. And that makes sense. You know, if you are within the mainstream of the dominant culture, then you'll be familiar with the religions of the dominant culture. Your own religion, which is practiced by a fringe group, and I'm talking about even within Judaism. You know, we're talking about a very small minority of people in America, but the percentage of practicing Jews is even smaller than that. So where would they have access to Jewish knowledge, Jewish learning? You know, so they're blameless. I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about people who consciously give it up. Who consciously give it up. Those people who have learned and do know, for what? What do they give it up for? Right? It's usually not because of some intellectual issue. It's not because they've analyzed Judaism from top to bottom and they found it wanting. It doesn't adequately answer their philosophical dilemmas. That's not the case at all. Usually it's a lifestyle choice. There is something that they want to be free of. Judaism has restrictions, it has rules, it controls our lives. They want the freedom to live a lifestyle which is they consider more pleasant or more enjoyable, etc. So, as Reb Chaim Brisker once put it, they're not grappling with questions. They don't have questions, they have answers. Right? The rejection of Judaism is an answer. It's not a question. And that's what it's all about. That's what it's all about. It's the choice of Torah versus Arias. It's not a question of Torah versus Plato. You know, people that think that are deluding themselves. You know, it's not that the foreign ideologies are so compelling that they pose a genuine challenge to Torah. I mean, it may be to a very intellectual person. It may be that his philosophical knowledge poses a challenge. But I think that those challenges can be dealt with. I think to a great extent the so-called off the derech phenomenon, whether it's teens off the derech or whether it's adults off the derech, is really rooted in something which is not intellectual at all. And Chazal say this. Chazal say that lo ovdu yisol avodah zarah lahatlem arayas. They only worshipped idolatry because they wanted to permit for themselves illicit sexual practices. In other words, they knew that avodah zarah had nothing to it, but they wanted to embrace an ideology which was more lenient in terms of what it would permit. So they said, "Oh, I practice that. I practice that ritual. Therefore, I can live a
where is that from?
Free life."
Where is that from?
What's that?
Sanhedrin?
Yeah. In any case, that's what we have to understand, that the threat of Greece, the threat of Yavon, as much as the Svarim tell us that it's the threat of the high culture of Hellenism versus Torah, the truth is it's not that at all. It's really the competition of the lifestyle that Hellenism permits versus the lifestyle which Torah demands of us. Right? It's a different question. And that's what the Maharal says. It's really Arias versus Torah. So in the same way that Babylonia was the agent of retribution for the sin of idolatry, and Persia was the agent of retribution for the sin of murder, Yavon was the agent of retribution for the sin of incest. You practice incest, illicit sexuality, you will be threatened with a force that will lead you into it. And that's what Yavon is all about. So the Maharal says that Yavon, it wasn't a question of intellectual ideas as much as the pull of Arias that would pull us away from Torah. It would pull us away from living on the spiritual plane on which succumbing to animal temptation would be beneath us, living on a lower plane where the temptations of the flesh are more enticing. This is the Maharal's understanding of what Yavon is all about. Question?
It mentions two very different players in the cure for Yavon. One is Shimon HaTzadik, which maybe is the cure for Alexander, right? And the Hashmonaim are the cure for Antiochus.
That's right. It's two different things, you see. In other words, Shimon HaTzadik really is the key to resisting Hellenist culture, right, what Alexander was selling, right? Matisyahu Kohen Gadol is the key to resisting coercion at the point of a sword, which is what Antiochus is coming to offer, right? So you need both leaders, right? You can't survive with one. You need to deal with both. But this is the amazing insight which the Maharal tells us, and I think it's something that we have to really think about seriously, right? Because what is the threat? You know, in the 1930s, there was a burning issue that was addressed by Gedolei Yisrael. There was a person, he was a yeshiva student. He later became a very, very important Rav in America, Rabbi Shimon Schwab, wrote a letter to various Gedolei Hador asking a question, that is it permissible for a Jew, a religious Jew, to attend university? This was the question. A very serious question. And he received 4 very, very lengthy responses. One was from Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, and one was from Baruch Breitowitz. The first was the Rosh Yeshiva, the Breitowitz Yeshiva. The second one was the Rosh Yeshiva for the Kamenetz Yeshiva. He received a response from the Rogatchover, who was the Rav in Tvinsk in Latvia. He received another one from the Telzer Rosh Yeshiva. And contrary to popular belief, it was not a one-word answer. It wasn't a no and it wasn't a yes. All the responses were very, very, very lengthy and technical, and they discussed the issues involved and the pros and the cons and the pluses and the minuses. But when you read the responses, they seem almost anachronistic because they were dealing with the German universities of the 1930s. And the main challenge, as they saw it, was the fact that these were hotbeds of intellectualism. And sometimes, maybe all the time, the intellectual side of the German university was antagonistic to Torah values. And they explain, again, if a person was going to school to learn a trade, umnus, learn a profession, a craft. That's certainly permitted, not just permitted, it's a mitzvah. A person is obligated to teach his son some means of earning a livelihood. But that wasn't the case. People did not go to university in Berlin in the 1930s to learn job skills. Right? Universities in those days were not vocational schools. It wasn't for the purpose of credentialing a person to, engage in a profession. It was to become an enlightened person. And that type of enlightenment was considered antagonistic to Torah. This was an issue that was repeated and echoed in all the various responses. But you fast forward 80 years, right? The modern university is not quite the same thing. First of all, with the abolition of the core curriculum, a person could go through 4 years of university and get no enlightenment at all, right? You can take courses that are very safe. If a person who wants to become an accountant, I don't think there's anything spiritually offensive in auditing or tax or any of the courses that an accountant has to take. And you probably can avoid anything which is really problematic. I always say just avoid Jewish studies. That's the worst thing. That's the one thing you don't want to take at university. But the issues that were dealt with then are not the issues now. The issues now are something else. That if you walk onto the campus and you look at the lifestyle of the campus, it's so abhorrent, it's so offensive, it's so unbelievably crass and crude that it would be incredible that any parent, any informed parent, would want his child to live in that environment. I don't hang out on college campuses, but there was a time that I was asked to speak on occasion, in New York, and I would go there, and every time I would go, I just felt I wanted to go to the mikveh and purify myself, after the. If a parent would ask me, I would say, listen, you want to send your kids to this institution? Go visit. Go visit. Spend a few hours there. Just go into the student center. Maybe walk through one of the dormitories. Get a flavor of the place. Right now, that story, by the way, is just what I saw with my own eyes. I mean, what I've heard, right, transcends that by far. Because we're dealing with something which at first glance is not intuitive, which is that when a Jew forsakes his Torah, it's not that he's at risk of embracing a different value system. He's really at risk of converting himself from a person who lives on the higher plane to a person who lives on the lower plane. That's what the morale is telling us. That it's not the threat of Yavon, right, is not Plato. The threat of Yavon is Arias. This is something that at first glance we don't swallow it. We don't buy it. But that's what the morale is telling us. That there was a sin of Gilui Arias, of illicit sexuality that was practiced. It had to be punished. The agent of that punishment was Yavon. Why? Because Yavon, by attacking Torah, really is taking us down that road to Arias. So you practice it voluntarily, you'll find yourself in that situation where you'll be compelled to practice it. And this is something that we have to be aware of. Just recently, my son-in-law gave me there was a student organization. I don't know if it still exists. A Jewish student organization called Yavna. I don't think it exists anymore.
Here?
Anywhere in the world. Does it still exist? I don't know if it exists. Maybe it does. Anyway, so they published a journal. So my son-in-law gave me, somebody found in some book sale, a copy of the Yavna Journal from one of the editions from 1960. 1961, 62, early years. And, they had articles there, like learned intellectual articles written by university sophomores. I mean, the level of scholarship was fantastic, and the level of sophistication. It was breathtaking. But that's not where we're at today. We're really at a very, very different place in time. I think the morale, in a sense, was almost prophetic, right, in presenting the conflict with Yavan as being very, very different than we conventionally think. And we conventionally think that it's a question of one value system as opposed to another value system. It's really a question of living a life of value versus living a life of no value. But Shimon HaTzadik gives us that ability to stand. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Alexander the Great this apparition of Shimon HaTzadik whenever he would wage war. If there was no Shimon HaTzadik, Alexander the Great couldn't have been successful. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu always gives us the cure before the illness. And that's what the Gemara tells us. And so as well, that if we have to resist temptation, we have to know that Torah gives us that ability to do it. Not always, it's not a perfect cure, but it's the best we have. Chazal say, Barasi Yetzer Hara, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I made an evil inclination, Barasi Torah Tavna. And if it doesn't work 100% of the time, but it doesn't work much of the time, and therefore our own devotion to studying Torah, living Torah, and allowing our lives to be guided by Torah really is the key to being able to live on that higher plane, which is really the challenge of our times, very much the challenge of our times. Well, you did some Chanukah thoughts. Everyone should have a very, very enlightened last few days, and Be'ez Hashem, next week we will meet again. Thank you for coming.
Okay.